One of the things about running a disaster channel on YouTube and researching the many and varied ways in which one might find oneself staring tragedy in the face is that you tend to become more aware of the possible dangers in any given situation. In small doses, this is probably a good thing, although it can be a bit annoying for friends and family. For example, I went to the cinema the other week with my family and found myself looking for the emergency exits and counting how many rows of seats up we were in case we had to find the exit in complete darkness. Pointing this out to my family invariably resulted in much eye-rolling, followed by whispers of, "Dad, be quiet, the film's starting." But in my defence, well, you never know, because as I've learned, tragedy can occur anywhere, even in the cinema. The Cinema Statuto was a cheap seats second-run picture house located in Turin's San Donato district, just northwest of the city centre. It was a bit of a neighbourhood landmark. It was built in 1924, and so by 1983 it had been open for almost 60 years. It had 2 floors of seating, the main floor area and an upper gallery. It was cheap and a bit old-fashioned, but that's what people liked about it. Sunday the 13th of February was a cold day. It had been snowing in the afternoon, and the thought of nestling down for an hour and a half in the warm, cosy darkness of the Statuto cinema must have been quite appealing. Indeed, there were an estimated 200 to 300 patrons inside for the tea time showing, even though the movie was This French Comedy, which was by now on its 13th week of being shown. The film started at 5:30, but at around 6:15, 45 minutes into the movie when the comedy was really getting going, the audience were disrupted by a loud noise at the rear of the auditorium. Survivors would later describe it as a dull thud, possibly like a gas stove flaring into life. The sound came from the right-hand corridor behind a curtain placed at the back end of the auditorium to separate the hallway from the seating area. Whatever it was, it caused something to ignite, as within seconds, flames had taken hold of the heavy synthetic curtain. Yes, you heard that right, synthetic curtain. This was the early 80s, and places like the Cinema Statuto still had lots of 1970s plastic decor in place. Within seconds, the curtain was ablaze, and as burning pieces of it fell, they ignited the rear row of seats, which in turn ignited plastic panelling on the lower walls. Now, these were not slow-burning materials. The fire leapt from surface to surface, quickly catching the ceiling drapery. People in the ground floor stalls at least had some chance to react. They saw the flickering of the first flames and got up immediately. Some shouted out a warning, as others made straight for the main exit, although the warning may not have been heard, as at this point the film was still running. The manager, although aware that a fire had broken out, kept the lights off and kept the film running to avoid panic. In the event, avoiding panic would be the least of the worries for the people who were now trapped inside the cinema, and they were trapped. The blazing curtain had effectively cut off the main exit out to the lobby, and the emergency exit doors had been locked and chained to prevent anyone sneaking in without paying. Some ran for a corridor leading off to one side, but this was just a dead end. It only led to the toilets. And in the main auditorium, the toxic smoke was spreading, thick, black, and deadly. By now, the power had failed, plunging the room into a darkness only lit by the light of the flames dimmed through the thick smoke. The emergency lighting didn't come on, and for anyone who was unfamiliar with the layout or seated any distance from the available exit, there was no frame of reference. Even if there was an exit to run to, you couldn't tell which way it was anymore. In the upper gallery, the situation was even worse. The flames had reached the drapery in under a minute, and the burning air and toxic gases funneled towards the ceiling. There were also some emergency exits on the upstairs level, but again, most of these had been locked from the outside. For those people up in the gallery, it was pretty much all over before they even had time to realise exactly what was going on. Such was the toxicity of the smoke and the speed with which the gallery was engulfed by it. You see, the smoke and the heat were just part of the problem. Polyurethane, which is what the cinema seats were filled with, releases carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide when it burns. The combination of these gases is deadly. After inhaling just a few breaths, one would quickly lose consciousness. Many victims were found still in their chairs, slumped over as if asleep. Others made it as far as the stairwell, only to find it pitch black and blocked by smoke. One woman who escaped from the lower floor later recalled, "We thought it was part of the film at first, that red glow under the curtain, but the heat came instantly. I turned around and people were already falling." Now, the fire brigade had arrived swiftly. Such was the ferocity of the blaze that the fire itself was already waning, beginning to burn itself out, but the smoke was overwhelming. Firefighters apparently entered the building wearing only basic breathing gear, and some apparently didn't have any at all. Inside the cinema, visibility was basically zero, and the firemen could only find bodies by touching them. One recalled, "We didn't even realise how many were up there at first. We thought most people had run away. But they were there, but they were gone." Fire Brigade Officer Enzo Ariu, who responded to the call, remembered the scene. "Outside, we ran up a twisting staircase to reach the first two doors. Beppe smashed one open with a pick. Silvano broke through the masonite panel of the second with his fists. We were hit by thick smoke and intense heat filling the room beyond. The heat and smoke were unbearable. When they began to clear, we found a very young girl collapsed by the second door. She was already dead." The bodies were brought out one by one and laid in rows along the icy pavement outside the cinema. Emergency crews had marked the position of each body with handwritten tags. As more victims were recovered, they were moved to a nearby garage behind the cinema, which had been hastily converted into a temporary morgue. The official death toll was 64. Most victims had died from asphyxiation. A few people were hospitalised with burns to the throat, but most of the people who did escape were uninjured. It was one of those tragedies. You either got out unharmed, or you didn't get out at all. After the fire, investigators quickly identified several critical factors that had contributed to the scale of the disaster. The rapid development of toxic smoke, the widespread use of flammable and synthetic materials, and the near-total failure of the building's evacuation systems. But they also uncovered something deeper than that, and that was really the structural failure of Italy's fire safety laws as a whole. You see, the Cinema Statuto hadn't failed its most recent safety inspection. It had passed them no problem. The trouble was, these approvals had been largely procedural. They're based more on bureaucratic box-ticking than on any meaningful actual assessment of risk. Emergency signage was either non-functional or missing altogether. Exit doors lacked panic bars, and they were locked. There was no smoke extraction system of any kind. The furnishings and fabrics released poisonous gases if ignited. But legally speaking, none of these shortcomings violated the standards in force at the time, because the standards themselves were next to useless. Under the Italian fire code then in effect, materials like polyurethane foam and PVC plastics could still be certified as flame retardant, provided they met some very basic ignition tests. But the regulations focused almost exclusively on how long materials resisted fire, not on what kind of gases they produced when they were burning. In the Statuto case, even a limited ignition of seat padding released a cocktail of toxic gas, most notably hydrogen cyanide and carbon monoxide, both lethal in small doses and capable of rendering victims unconscious within minutes. There was no requirement for materials to be rated by toxicity or at the speed at which the fumes accumulated in the enclosed spaces. Nor was there any legal obligation for cinemas to conduct practical evacuation drills or to ensure that all exits remained unlocked during operation. In essence, the building was in full compliance with the law, just not with the reality of how fires actually kill people. And the Statuto tragedy forced regulators to confront that reality gap and to reconsider what fire safety really meant when they had to measure it against a room full of dead people. The manager of the cinema, Raimondo Capello, was arrested and charged with negligent homicide. He was later sentenced to 8 years in prison, with his assets seized as compensation for the victims' families. Now that might sound like some measure of justice, but was he solely to blame? One report describes him as a simple man who died a few years later, consumed by guilt. Of course, his decision to lock almost all of the exit doors was a stupid, reckless one, but it wasn't an illegal one. At the end of the day, Raimondo Capello was just a simple man whose cinema conformed to the death trap regulations that were in force at the time. Several others, including the cinema projectionist and the resident upholsterer, were also sentenced to jail time, although these sentences were reduced on appeal. As for the supervisory commission that had issued the safety report and passed the cinema inspection, none of its members were ever convicted. In 1995, the Italian Court of Auditors ruled in their favour. The cinema itself never reopened. It stood derelict for more than a decade before finally being demolished in 1996. To this day, there's never been a definitive reason as to what started the fire. Police initially suspected arson, as there had been a wave of arson attacks in cinemas in Turin the previous summer, but in the end, no actual cause could be found. The best anyone could come up with was that it was probably some sort of short circuit in the wiring somewhere. The Statuto cinema fire triggered a nationwide reassessment of public safety standards. Italian fire codes for theatres, clubs and cinemas were rewritten pretty much from scratch. Crush bars became mandatory on the exit doors, so did illuminated exit signs, smoke evac systems, and routine inspections based on actual fire simulations rather than just filling in paperwork requirements. Materials previously certified as flame resistant were reclassified according to how they burned and what they released when they were on fire. The funerals for the victims of the Cinema Statuto fire were held on Wednesday the 16th of February, just 3 days after the disaster. A mass service took place in the Cimitero Monumentale di Torino. More than 10,000 people attended, including grieving relatives, fire crews and stunned local residents. The ceremony was led by the Archbishop of Turin, and also present was the Italian President Sandro Pertini. Rows of identical wooden coffins were lined up in the front of the chapel, each bearing flowers on a name card, although a few still did lack identification. The city had offered a collective burial for both practical reasons and because the cinema tragedy had, by then, blurred individual grief into something that had affected the whole of the city of Turin. For example, during the service, public transport was halted across parts of the city, and all the flags on the official buildings were lowered to half-mast. The Cinema Statuto fire was, and remains, the deadliest loss of life in Turin since the end of the Second World War. 64 people died in a matter of minutes, almost all from inhaling toxic fumes, in a building that met the legal standards of the day. In the decades since, no other single event in the city has claimed as many lives in one place at one time.